The dust kicked up from Samuel Washington's worn boots as he walked down the main street of Cedar Ridge. It was just past noon on a scorching hot day in July 1867, and the small desert town seemed almost empty. Most folks were smart enough to stay inside during the worst heat of the day. Samuel pulled his hat down lower over his eyes and quickened his pace toward the general store. At 32 years old, Samuel had been a free man for just over 2 years now. The war had ended, Lincoln had signed the papers, and Samuel had walked away from the plantation in Georgia that had been his prison for most of his life. He made his way west like so many others, looking for work, looking for a fresh start, looking for something he couldn't quite name, but hoped he'd know when he found it. He'd been working at the silver mine outside town for 6 months now. The work was hard, dangerous even, but Samuel didn't mind. Every dollar he earned was his own. Every decision he made was his choice. After a lifetime of being told when to wake up, when to eat, when to work, and when to sleep, this freedom still felt strange and wonderful. Samuel was almost to the store when he heard it. A low moan coming from the narrow alley between the bank and the barber shop. He stopped walking and listened. There it was again, weak and desperate. Someone was in trouble. His first thought was to keep walking. In his experience, getting involved in other people's problems usually led to trouble, especially for a man like him. But something about that sound wouldn't let him move on. It reminded him of the way his little sister had cried when she was sick, back before she'd been sold to a plantation 3 states away. Samuel turned toward the alley and stepped into the shade between the buildings. What he saw there made his blood run cold. A man lay crumpled against the sidewall, his clothes torn and filthy, his face burned red by the sun. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and his eyes were closed. For a moment, Samuel thought the stranger might already be dead. Then the man's chest rose slightly, and another weak moan escaped his throat. Samuel knelt down beside the dying man and reached for his water canteen. As he tilted the stranger's head back to give him a drink, the man's eyes fluttered open. They were pale blue eyes, eyes that Samuel had seen 1,000 times before. Eyes that had looked at him with cold indifference while deciding whether to sell his wife to another plantation. Eyes that had watched without emotion as Samuel's back was whipped raw for the crime of learning to read. Samuel's hand froze halfway to the man's mouth. Those pale blue eyes belonged to Colonel James Hartwell, the man who had owned him for 15 years. For a long moment, neither man moved. Hartwell's eyes were unfocused, but there was a flicker of recognition in them. His cracked lips moved, but no sound came out. Samuel felt his own heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. This was the man who had bought him when he was just 17 years old? The man who had separated him from his mother and father. The man who had branded his shoulder with a hot iron like he was livestock. The man who had sold his wife Lucy to settle a gambling debt, then sold their 2 children to different plantations. When Samuel became too difficult to manage, Samuel looked down at Colonel Hartwell and felt 15 years of buried rage rising in his chest like floodwater. Here was his chance. Here was justice served up by the desert itself. All he had to do was walk away. Leave the man who had destroyed his family to die alone in this alley like a dog. No one would ever know. No one would ever blame him, he started to stand up, but then he looked at Hartwell again, really looked at him. This wasn't the proud, well-dressed plantation owner he remembered. This wasn't the man who had sat on his horse giving orders while other men did the dirty work. This was just a broken old man dying alone, probably hadn't eaten in days, certainly hadn't had water in longer than that. Samuel had heard stories about what happened to plantation owners after the war. Some had managed to keep their land and adapt to paying wages instead of owning people. Others had lost everything and ended up wandering the country like ghosts of their former selves. Looking at Hartwell now, Samuel could see which group he'd fallen into. The colonel's fine clothes were nothing but rags now. His face was thin and hollow, like he'd been hungry for months. His hands, which Samuel remembered as soft and clean, were now cut and calloused. Whatever had brought James Hartwell to this alley in this forgotten desert town, it hadn't been kind to him. Samuel found himself thinking about something his grandmother used to tell him back when he was just a little boy. She'd say, "Samuel, baby, the measure of a man ain't what he does when it's easy, it's what he does when it's hard. When everything in him wants to choose hate, but he chooses something else instead." He knelt back down beside Hartwell and lifted the water canteen to the dying man's lips. A few drops of precious water trickled into his mouth, and Hartwell's eyes opened again. This time they focused on Samuel's face. "I know you," Hartwell whispered, his voice like sandpaper on wood. "Yes, sir, you do," Samuel replied quietly. "You single quote your Samuel. From the plantation. That's right." Hartwell closed his eyes and was quiet for a long moment. When he opened them again, there was something different in them. Something that might have been shame? "Why?" Hartwell asked. Samuel knew what he was asking. Why was he here? Why was he helping? Why wasn't he walking away and leaving him to die? Samuel didn't have a good answer for that question. He wasn't even sure he understood it himself. All he knew was that when he looked at this broken man, he didn't see his former master anymore. He just saw another human being who was about to die if somebody didn't help him. "Because it's the right thing to do," Samuel said finally. He helped. Hartwell sat up and gave him another small sip of water. And then he looked around the alley, thinking hard. The man was in bad shape, worse than bad. He needed food, water, and medical attention. And he needed all three soon. The closest doctor was in Copper Falls, about 40 miles east through some of the worst desert in the territory. Samuel had made that journey before, but never carrying someone else, never with limited supplies, and never in the middle of summer when the heat could kill a healthy man in a matter of hours. It would be dangerous. It might be impossible. And it definitely wasn't his responsibility, but as Samuel looked at James Hartwell struggling to stay conscious, he made a decision that surprised even him. He was going to try to save the life of the man who had once owned him like property. He just hoped he wouldn't regret it. Samuel stood up and brushed the dust off his knees. "Can you walk at all, Colonel?" Hartwell shook his head weakly. "I don't think so." Samuel nodded. He'd figured as much. "Then I guess I'm gonna have to carry you." The look of confusion and disbelief in Hartwell's eyes was something Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. Here was a man who had never shown mercy to anyone, receiving mercy from the very person he'd shown the least mercy to of all. Samuel went to gather supplies for the journey that would test everything he believed about himself, about forgiveness, and about what it truly meant to be free. Samuel spent the next hour gathering everything he could for the journey ahead. From his small room above the general store, he took his strongest blanket, his extra shirt, and every bit of food he had saved up. He filled both his canteens at the town well and bought as much jerky and hardtack as his money would allow. The store owner, a kind man named Pete, didn't ask questions when Samuel explained he needed supplies for a sick traveler. When Samuel returned to the alley, Colonel Hartwell was unconscious again. His breathing was shallow, and his skin felt like it was on fire. Samuel knew they had to leave soon, before the afternoon heat got even worse. Getting Hartwell onto his back wasn't easy. The man was thin from hunger, but he was still dead weight. Samuel had to position him carefully, with Hartwell's arms draped over his shoulders and his legs wrapped around Samuel's waist. It reminded Samuel uncomfortably of the way he used to carry sacks of cotton, except this sack used to own him. The first few steps out of town were the hardest. Samuel's legs nearly buckled under the unexpected weight, and sweat was already running down his face. A few townspeople stopped to stare at the strange sight of a black man carrying a white man on his back. One old woman shook her head and muttered something about fool behavior, but Samuel ignored her and kept walking. By the time they reached the edge of Cedar Ridge, the sun was already brutal. Samuel could feel it beating down on his back like a hammer, and they'd barely started their journey. 40 miles of this lay ahead of them, through some of the most unforgiving land in the territory. The desert stretched out before them like an ocean of sand and rock. There was no road, just a rough trail that wound between the cactus and scrub brush. Samuel had traveled this path before, but always on horseback and always with plenty of water. Now he was on foot, carrying a man who might die before they reached help, with only 2 canteens and hope to sustain them. For the first hour, Hartwell stayed unconscious, which Samuel figured was probably a mercy. The man's head lolled against Samuel's shoulder, and occasionally he would mumble something that sounded like names or places from long ago. Samuel tried not to listen too closely. He had enough ghosts of his own without borrowing Hartwell's. The sun climbed higher, and the temperature rose with it. Samuel had to stop every 15 minutes to rest and take small sips of water. He was already rationing it carefully, knowing that what they had might need to last 2 full days. Every time he stopped, he would give Hartwell a few drops from the canteen, watching to make sure the unconscious man could swallow without choking around midday. When the heat was at its worst, Samuel found a large boulder that cast a small patch of shade. He carefully lowered Hartwell to the ground and spread out his blanket. Both men lay in the tiny bit of relief the shade provided, panting like dogs. It was then that Hartwell's eyes opened for the first time since they'd left town. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice cracked and dry. "About 5 miles out of Cedar Ridge, heading toward Copper Falls," Samuel replied. Offering him the canteen, Hartwell took a small sip and looked around, confused. "Why are we in the desert?" "Because you're dying and there's a doctor in Copper Falls who might be able to help you." For a moment, Hartwell seemed to be trying to remember something. His eyes focused on Samuel's face and recognition flickered there briefly. "You're that boy from the plantation," he said. "The one who could read?" Samuel felt his jaw tighten. "I wasn't a boy, Colonel. I was 27 years old when you sold my wife." Hartwell blinked slowly, as if trying to process this information. "Lucy," he said suddenly. Her name was Lucy. The sound of his wife's name coming from Hartwell's lips hit Samuel like a physical blow. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Lucy had been gone for 5 years now, sold to a plantation in Mississippi to pay off one of Hartwell's gambling debts. Samuel had tried to find her after the war ended, but the plantation had been burned during Sherman's march. No one knew what had happened to the slaves who lived there. "Why did you sell her?" Samuel asked, the words coming out before he could stop them. Hartwell closed his eyes. "I needed the money," he said simply. "I always needed the money." The honesty in his voice was somehow worse than any excuse would have been. Samuel had spent years imagining that Hartwell had sold Lucy out of cruelty or spite, but the truth was more ordinary and somehow more terrible. She'd been sold simply because she was worth $800, and Hartwell had needed $800 before Samuel could respond. Hartwell's eyes closed again, and he drifted back into unconsciousness. Samuel sat there for a long time, listening to the man's labored breathing and trying to understand why he was risking his life to save someone who had destroyed his. When the sun started to move lower in the sky, Samuel knew they had to keep going. The desert was dangerous enough in daylight, but traveling at night brought different problems. He lifted Hartwell back onto his shoulders and continued along the trail. The next few hours were a blur of heat and exhaustion. Samuel's shirt was soaked with sweat, his legs were cramping, and his throat felt like sandpaper. Every step was an effort, and the weight on his back seemed to grow heavier with each mile. Several times he had to stop and rest, lowering Hartwell to the ground while he caught his breath and forced himself to take only the smallest sips of water. As evening approached, Hartwell began to mumble again, louder this time. At first it was just nonsense, but gradually Samuel began to make out words. "Shouldn't have done it," Hartwell was saying. "Shouldn't have separated them. Just babies. They were just babies." Samuel realized that Hartwell was talking about his children, Thomas and little Ruth. They'd been 8 and 5 when Hartwell sold them to different plantations. Samuel had begged, had offered to work extra hours, had promised anything if Hartwell would just keep the family together. But the colonel had needed money quickly, and children sold for good prices. "The woman cried for 3 days, Hartwell continued, his voice thick with fever. Wouldn't eat, wouldn't stop crying. Had to have her watched so she wouldn't hurt herself." Samuel knew he was talking about Lucy now, The woman cried for 3 days. Samuel had never known that detail before, had never known exactly how Lucy had reacted when their children were taken. The knowledge cut through him like a knife, but there was something else in Hartwell's voice now. Something Samuel had never heard there before. Guilt. Real. Genuine guilt. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, Samuel found a sheltered spot behind some rocks where they could spend the night. He made a small fire with brush and gave Hartwell more water and a few pieces of jerky, soaked until they were soft enough to swallow. In the flickering firelight, with the desert wind howling around them, Samuel looked at the man he was risking everything to save. Colonel James Hartwell, who had once seemed so powerful and untouchable, now looked like nothing more than a sick old man who might not live to see another sunrise. And for the first time since he'd found Hartwell in that alley, Samuel began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, carrying this burden across the desert might somehow help him carry the burden he'd been carrying in his heart for all these years. The desert night was going to be long and cold, and they still had 35 miles to go. The second day started before sunrise. Samuel had barely slept, partly because of the cold desert night and partly because Hartwell had been talking in his sleep for hours. Not the mumbled nonsense from before, but clear words that cut through. Samuel like a blade. As the first light crept across the horizon, Samuel checked their water supply and felt his stomach drop. They had less than half a canteen left, and they still had more than 25 miles to go. At this rate, they'd both die of thirst long before they reached Copper Falls, but there was no choice now. They were too far from Cedar Ridge to turn. Back and going forward was their only hope. Samuel lifted Hartwell onto his back again, his muscles screaming in protest. Every part of his body hurt from his feet to his shoulders, but he started walking anyway. The morning sun was gentler than the afternoon heat, but Samuel knew that mercy wouldn't last long. As they moved across the desert floor, stepping carefully around cactus and loose rocks, Samuel's mind began to wander back to places he usually tried not to go. He thought about the plantation in Georgia, about the small cabin where he'd lived with Lucy and the children. It wasn't much, just one room with a dirt floor and walls that let in the cold in winter, but it had been theirs. On Sundays, when there was no work in the fields, Lucy would sing while she cooked whatever little food they had. Thomas would play with sticks and stones, pretending they were horses and soldiers. Little Ruth would sit in Samuel's lap while he told her stories about places far away, places where people like them were free. Those had been the good moments, the ones that made life bearable. But they were mixed with so many terrible memories, too. The day Hartwell had discovered that Samuel could read, after his mistress had secretly taught him letters. The whipping that followed, 20 lashes that left scars Samuel still carried. The night they took Lucy away, how she'd screamed his name as they loaded her into the wagon. The morning they came for the children, how Thomas had fought and kicked while Ruth just cried. Samuel had tried so hard to forget those days, to put them behind him and look forward. But carrying Hartwell across this desert, listening to the man's fevered confessions, was bringing it all back like a flood. "I remember you reading," Hartwell said suddenly, his voice startling Samuel out of his memories. "You were reading to the children from the Bible." Samuel stumbled slightly but kept walking. He hadn't realized Hartwell was awake. "My wife taught you," Hartwell continued, his voice weak but clear. "Elizabeth taught you to read." "I was so angry when I found out, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell." Samuel remembered her well. She'd been kind to the slaves when her husband wasn't watching, sneaking them extra food and medicine when they were sick. She'd taught Samuel his letters in the big house kitchen while Hartwell was away on business trips. She'd made him promise never to tell anyone, saying it would bring trouble for both of them. "She was a good woman," Samuel said quietly. "She left me after the war," Hartwell replied. "Took our daughter and moved back to her family in Virginia. Said she couldn't stand to look at me anymore, couldn't stand what I'd become." There was so much pain in Hartwell's voice that Samuel almost felt sorry for him, but then he remembered little Ruth's face on the day she was sold, how she'd reach for him with her tiny hands while the slave trader loaded her into his wagon. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat. Samuel had to stop more frequently now, not just to rest, but because his vision was starting to blur. Twice he stumbled and nearly fell, the weight of Hartwell almost bringing them both down. His throat was so dry it felt like swallowing glass. But he didn't dare drink more than a few drops at a time. During one of their rest stops, huddled in the shade of a scraggly desert tree, Hartwell started talking again. "I dream about them sometimes," he said, staring up at the harsh blue sky. "All the people I sold, all the families I broke apart. They come to me in my dreams and ask me why." Samuel listened despite himself. He'd never imagined that Hartwell thought about the slaves as real people, as human beings with feelings and families. "There was an old man named Joseph," Hartwell continued. "Must have been 60 years old. I sold him to pay for my daughter's wedding dress. 60 years old, and I sent him to work sugarcane in Louisiana. He died within a month." Samuel remembered Joseph. The old man had been like a grandfather to all the children on the plantation, telling them stories and teaching them which plants were good for medicine. Samuel had wondered what happened to him after he disappeared one day, but now he knew. And, there was a young woman, couldn't have been more than 16. Sold her because she was pretty and I knew she'd bring a good price. I didn't think about what would happen to her after. Hartwell's voice broke slightly. I never thought about what happened to any of them after they left my property. Samuel felt anger rising in his chest like bile. "You never thought about it because you didn't want to think about it. We weren't people to you. We were just things you could buy and sell." "I know that now," Hartwell whispered. "God help me, I know that now." They sat in silence for a while, two men sharing shade in the middle of nowhere, bound together by a history neither of them could escape. Samuel watched a hawk circle overhead and thought about how different things might have been if men like Hartwell had seen slaves as human beings from the beginning. How many families would have stayed together? How many lives would have been saved? But there was no point in wondering about what might have been. Samuel had learned long ago that the past couldn't be changed. Only lived with Dot when they started walking again, Samuel noticed that his legs were shaking with exhaustion. The last of their water was almost gone, and they still had miles to go. Worse, Hartwell seemed to be getting sicker instead of better. His fever was higher, and he was barely conscious most of the time. Samuel began to face the possibility that they might both die out here in this desert, that his decision to save his former master might end up killing them both. Part of him wondered if that would be justice of a sort, for both of them to end up buried in the same unmarked grave in the middle of nowhere. But another part of him, the part that had kept him alive through 15 years of slavery, refused to give up. Lucy had always said he was the strongest man she knew, not because of his muscles, but because of his heart. "You got something inside you that they can't break," she used to tell him. "Something that stays good no matter what they do to you." As the afternoon heat grew unbearable and Samuel's strength began to fail, he held on to those words. He thought about Lucy's smile and Thomas's laugh and Ruth's tiny hand in his. He thought about Mrs. Elizabeth teaching him to read by candlelight. He thought about his grandmother's wisdom about choosing something other than hate when everything anyone wants to hate, and somehow he kept walking. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon when Samuel saw something that made his heart leap. In the distance, maybe 5 miles away, he could see buildings. Copper Falls. They were going to make it. But just as hope began to fill his chest, Samuel's legs finally gave out. He collapsed to his knees, Hartwell sliding off his back onto the desert floor. Samuel tried to stand, tried to take another step, but his body wouldn't obey him anymore. For the first time since they'd started this journey, Samuel began to wonder if they'd come this far only to die within sight of salvation. Samuel lay face down in the hot sand, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His legs felt like they were made of water, and black spots danced in front of his eyes. The buildings of Copper Falls shimmered in the distance like a mirage. So close he could almost count the windows, but they might as well have been on the moon. Beside him, Colonel Hartwell had also fallen when Samuel collapsed. The sick man lay on his back, staring up at the blazing afternoon sun with glassy eyes. For several minutes, neither man moved. The only sounds were their ragged breathing and the whisper of wind across the desert. Samuel tried to push himself up, but his arms shook and gave out. He'd pushed his body beyond its limits, and now it was refusing to obey him. 3 days of carrying a grown man across the desert with almost no food and barely any water had drained every ounce of strength from his muscles. "Get up," he whispered. To himself, the same words he'd used to survive 15 years of slavery. Just get up and keep going. But his body wouldn't listen. For the first time since this journey began, Samuel felt real fear creeping into his heart. They were so close to help, maybe an hour's walk if they could manage it. But an hour might as well be 100 miles if neither of them could stand. Samuel closed his eyes and thought about giving up. It would be easy to just lie here in the sand and let the desert take them both. At least they'd die as free men under the open sky, not in chains in some plantation field. Maybe that was enough, but then he heard something that made him open his eyes. Movement beside him. Grunting and the sound of someone struggling. Samuel turned his head and couldn't believe what he saw. Colonel Hartwell was trying to sit up. The man who'd been unconscious or delirious for most of the past 3 days was fighting to get to his feet. "What are you doing?" Samuel asked, his voice barely a croak. Hartwell didn't answer at first. He was too busy struggling to stand, using his hands to push himself up from the sand. His face was red with effort and sweat poured down his cheeks, but somehow he managed to get to his knees. "You carried me this far," Hartwell said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I'm not letting you die within sight of help." Samuel watched in amazement as his former master, a man who hadn't done a day of hard labor in his entire life, fought to stand upright. Hartwell's legs were shaking, and he swayed like he might fall over at any moment, but he stayed on his feet. "Can you sit up?" Hartwell asked, reaching down toward Samuel. It was the strangest thing Samuel had ever experienced. The man who had once owned him was now asking his permission, asking if he could help. Not ordering, not demanding, but asking. With Hartwell's help, Samuel managed to sit up. The world spun around him and his stomach felt sick, but he was upright. Then, very slowly, with Hartwell supporting most of his weight, Samuel got to his feet. For a moment they stood there together, 2 men who could barely walk, holding each other up in the middle of the desert. Samuel had never imagined he would ever lean on James Hartwell for anything, but here they were. "Can you walk?" Hartwell asked. Samuel tried to take a step and nearly fell. His legs felt like they belonged to someone else. But Hartwell caught him and held him steady. "We'll go slow," Hartwell said. "Lean on me." And so they began the strangest walk of either man's life. The former slave and the former master stumbling across the desert sand with their arms around each other's shoulders. Every step was an effort, every breath a struggle, but somehow they kept moving forward. Samuel had never seen this side of James Hartwell before. The proud, arrogant plantation owner was gone, replaced by a man who was willing to use the last of his strength to help someone else. Every few minutes, Hartwell would ask, "Are you all right? Or do you need to rest?" Words that had never passed his lips during all the years he'd owned slaves. After they'd walked for maybe 10 minutes, covering what felt like 100 yards, Hartwell spoke again. "I need to tell you something," he said, breathing hard from the effort of walking. "Back at the plantation, when you asked me not to sell your family, I could have said no. I had other options. I could have sold land or horses or anything else." Samuel didn't respond, but he kept listening. "I sold Lucy and the children because it was easier," Hartwell continued. "Because I didn't want to think of them as real people with real feelings. It was easier to tell myself they were just property." Samuel felt old anger stirring in his chest, but it was mixed with something else now. Something that might have been pity. "Why are you telling me this?" Samuel asked. Hartwell stopped walking for a moment and looked at Samuel directly. "Because I need you to know that I know what I did. I need you to know that I understand what I took from you." They started walking again, their feet shuffling through the sand like old men, which Samuel supposed they were now. Old men who had seen too much and carried too much? There's something else, Hartwell said after a while. When Elizabeth taught you to read, and I found out and had you whipped, she begged me not to do it. She said you were a good man, that you deserved better. I whipped you anyway because I was angry that she'd disobeyed me. Samuel remembered that day clearly. 20 lashes that left scars on his back he still carried. He'd always wondered how Colonel Hartwell had found out about the reading lessons. She cried afterwards, Hartwell continued. My own wife cried because of what I did to you, and I was angry at her for crying. They walked in silence for a while, concentrating on putting one foot in front of the other. The buildings of Copper Falls were getting closer, but they were still painfully far away. Samuel found himself thinking about something he'd never considered before. All these years he'd thought of Colonel Hartwell as a man who lived without consequences, who could do whatever he wanted without paying a price. But listening to him now, Samuel began to understand that Hartwell had been paying a price all along. The price was his own soul. Why did you become that kind of man? Samuel asked. You must have been different once. Hartwell was quiet for so long that Samuel thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know, he said. Maybe I was afraid. Maybe it was easier to think of you as less than human than to admit I was doing something evil. Maybe I was just weak. The word hit Samuel like a physical blow. Weak. In all the years he'd known James Hartwell, he'd thought of him as many things. Cruel, cold, powerful, heartless, but never weak. Yet looking at the broken man beside him, Samuel began to see that maybe weakness was exactly what it had been. The weakness of a man who chose the easy path instead of the right one. I used to lie awake at night sometimes, Hartwell continued, wondering what happened to the people I sold. Wondering if they were still alive, if they had enough to eat, if they were being treated well. But I never let myself wonder for very long. They were close enough to Copper Falls now that Samuel could see people moving around in the streets. Someone must have spotted them, because a group of men was heading their way. Help was coming, but Hartwell wasn't finished talking. Samuel, he said, stopping again and turning to face him. I want you to know something. In all my years of owning slaves, buying and selling human beings like livestock, I never met a man with more strength than you. Not physical strength, though you have that too. Strength of character. You had something I never had and never will have. Samuel looked at his former master, this broken man who was using his last bit of strength to help the person he'd wronged most. What's that? Samuel asked. The strength to choose mercy when you had every right to choose revenge. The rescue party from Copper Falls reached them just as both men's legs finally gave out completely. Strong hands caught them and carried them the last 100 yards to safety. But Samuel barely noticed the commotion around them. He was still thinking about Hartwell's words, still trying to understand what had just happened between them. For the first time in his life, Samuel had seen his former master as just another broken human being, and somehow that changed everything. The doctor in Copper Falls was a kind man named Dr. Bennett, who didn't ask too many questions when the townspeople carried 2 half-dead men into his clinic. He took one look at Samuel and Colonel Hartwell and immediately went to work, giving them water slowly so they wouldn't get sick, cleaning their cuts and sunburns, and putting them both to bed in his back room. For the first day, both men mostly slept. Samuel's body felt like it had been put through a mill, every muscle aching, and his skin burned raw by the desert sun. But he was alive, and so was Hartwell, which seemed like a miracle considering how close they'd come to dying in the sand. On the second day, Samuel was strong enough to sit up and eat some soup, Dr. Bennett told him. He'd probably saved both their lives by making it to town when he did. Another few hours in that heat, and they would have been beyond help. That man you carried, Dr. Bennett said, nodding toward the bed where Hartwell lay sleeping. He keeps talking about you when the fever takes him. Says you're the best man he ever knew. Samuel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. By the third day, Hartwell was awake and talking. The fever had broken, and though he was still weak, the color was coming back to his face. Samuel watched him carefully, still not sure what to make of this man who had once owned him, but had used his last strength to help him walk to safety on the fourth day. Dr. Bennett said they were both well enough to have visitors, and some of the townspeople came by to hear their story. Samuel told them about finding Hartwell dying in the alley and deciding to carry him to the doctor, but he left out most of the details about their past. That was between him and Hartwell, nobody else's business. The visitors were amazed by Samuel's act of mercy. One old woman shook her head and said she didn't know if she could have done the same thing. A young man called Samuel a hero. But Samuel didn't feel like a hero. He just felt confused about everything that had happened between him and his former master. It was on the fifth day that Samuel and Hartwell had their first real conversation since the desert. Dr. Bennett had gone to check on another patient, leaving them alone in the small room with its two narrow beds. "I owe you my life," Hartwell said quietly. Samuel was sitting by the window, looking out at the bustling street. "You don't owe me anything, Colonel. We're even now." "Even?" Hartwell asked. "How do you figure we're even?" Samuel turned to look at him. "You gave me 15 years of my life. I gave you 3 days of mine? Seems fair?" Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. "Those weren't your years to give, Samuel. I stole them from you. There's no making that even." Over the next few days, as both men grew stronger, they talked more than they ever had during all the years Samuel had lived on the plantation. Hartwell told Samuel about what had happened after the war, how he'd lost his land when he couldn't pay his debts, how his wife and daughter had left him, how he'd spent the last 2 years wandering from town to town with nothing but the clothes on his back. Samuel told Hartwell about his life as a free man, about the work he'd found and the small room he rented and the money he was saving. He even told him about the letters he'd written trying to find Lucy and the children, letters that had never been answered. "I hired a man once to look for them," Hartwell said suddenly. "After the war ended, I paid a detective to try to find the people I'd sold, to see what had happened to them." Samuel felt his heart stop. "What did you find out?" Hartwell's face was full of pain. "The plantation where I sold Lucy was burned during the war. Most of the slaves there were set free and scattered in different directions. The detective couldn't track her after that." Samuel had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed still hurt like a knife to the chest. "And the children?" Samuel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "Thomas was sold again twice before the war ended. Last anyone heard, he was working on a farm in Alabama as a free man. Ruth... Hartwell's voice broke slightly. "Ruth died of fever 2 years after I sold her. She was only 7 years old." Samuel felt the room spinning around him. Little Ruth, his baby girl, dead at 7 years old. All these years he'd been hoping to find her, imagining her grown up and happy somewhere, and she'd been dead almost as long as she'd been alive. "I'm sorry," Hartwell whispered. "I'm so sorry, Samuel. I know that doesn't mean anything, but I had to tell you." Samuel couldn't speak for a long time. He sat there staring out the window, watching people walk by on the street, ordinary people living ordinary lives while his world crumbled around him. His little Ruth was gone. Had been gone for years. When he finally found his voice, Samuel asked the question that had been haunting him since the desert. "Why did you tell me all this? Why didn't you just let me keep hoping she was alive somewhere?" Hartwell struggled to sit up in his bed. "Because you deserve to know the truth. Because I spent too many years lying to myself and everyone else, and I can't do that anymore." They talked until late that night, about things that had happened on the plantation, about people they both remembered, about the war and what came after. For the first time in either man's life, they talked to each other as equals, as two human beings who had shared a terrible history but were trying to find a way to live with it. By the end of the second week, Dr. Bennett said they were both healthy enough to leave. Samuel had already decided he would go back to Cedar Ridge and his job at the mine. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and it was his choice. Hartwell said he was going to continue west, maybe to California, to see if he could find work there. He had nothing to go back to in Georgia, and maybe it was time to start over completely on their last morning in Copper Falls. Samuel was packing his few belongings when Hartwell asked to speak with him outside. They walked to a small hill overlooking the town, where they could see for miles in every direction. "I want to give you something before I go," Hartwell said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small leather pouch and held it out to Samuel. "What is it?" Samuel asked. "It's not much. Maybe $40. It's all the money I have left in the world." Hartwell's hand was shaking slightly. "I know it can't buy back your family or undo what I did, but I want you to have it." Samuel looked at the pouch but didn't take it. "I don't want your money." "Colonel, then what do you want from me?" Hartwell asked, and there was genuine desperation in his voice. "Tell me what I can do to make this right, and I'll do it." Samuel was quiet for a long time, looking out over the desert they'd crossed. Together. "There's nothing you can do to make it right," he said finally. "What's done is done. Ruth is still dead. Lucy is still lost. Thomas is still scattered to the wind. Your $40 won't change any of that." Hartwell's shoulders sagged. "Then, what was the point of any of this? Why did you save me if there's no way to make things right?" Samuel turned to look at his former master, this broken man who had lost everything and was trying to find some way to live with what he'd done. "I didn't save you to make things right," Samuel said. "I saved you because it was the right thing to do." Hartwell stared at him for a long moment, and then something changed in his face. "You're a better man than I ever was or ever will be," he said quietly. "In all my years of thinking I was superior, of thinking I had the right to own other human beings, I never understood what real strength looked like. But I see it now." Samuel felt something shifting inside his chest, like a weight he'd been carrying for 15 years was finally starting to lift. "Samuel," Hartwell continued, his voice thick with emotion, "I spent my whole life believing I was better than men like you. But the truth is I'm not fit to shine your shoes. What you did for me in that desert, carrying me when you had every right to let me die, that's the kind of man I should have been, but never was." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, but not because they hurt. They cut through something deep inside him, something he hadn't even known was there. For 15 years, he'd carried the weight of being treated like he was less than human. And now, hearing James Hartwell acknowledge not just his humanity, but his superiority of character, Samuel felt that weight finally breaking apart. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," Hartwell said, tears running down his cheeks. "I don't deserve your mercy. But you gave it to me anyway, and that makes you the better man. It makes you the kind of man I wish I'd been strong enough to be." Samuel watched his former master cry, this man who had once seemed so powerful and untouchable, and felt something like peace settling over him. Not because Hartwell's words erased the past, but because they finally, truly, set Samuel free from it. "Goodbye, Colonel," Samuel said quietly. "Goodbye, Samuel, and thank you for everything." Samuel walked back down the hill toward town, leaving James Hartwell standing alone on the hilltop. As he packed his things and prepared to return to his life, Samuel felt lighter than he had in years. The desert had burned away something in both of them, leaving behind two men who finally understood what they were made of. Behind him, Samuel could hear the sound of a wagon heading west, carrying his former master toward whatever future awaited him. Samuel didn't look back. He had his own future to think about now, and for the first time in his life it belonged entirely to him.